Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Before we begin today's program, I wanted to talk briefly about a past guest, Jesse Ball, and an offer he has made to listeners on behalf of the program. I suspect many of you know who Jesse Ball is, since he was recently a guest on Between the Covers, and yet is already the second most listened to episode of all time. If you don't know him, you should definitely check out our conversation and explore his work. Jesse Ball sent me copies of his 2006 book that he co-wrote with the Icelandic poet and novelist Þórdís Beyoncé called Vera and Linus to offer as gifts for people who support the Between the Covers Patreon campaign. Vera and Linus is a gorgeous object, full of illustrations, and made with care by an Icelandic small press. The story is composed of a mixture of what could be called prose poetry, flash fiction, and sketches, and Publishers Weekly says of Vera and Linus, the light touch and often archaic feel of the prose owes as much to Kafka as to classic fairy tales. Certainly, many readers will find this book unsettling, but most will also find it hard not to remember a time when the world was filled with this kind of fearful mystery and wonder. Vera and Linus is out of print. The Icelandic publisher no longer exists, so this is a rare memento. For people who are not already supporters of the program, if you begin ongoing support of the show at $2 an episode through Patreon, that is patreon.com, patreon.com/betweenthecovers, you can receive a copy of Vera and Linus. If you're already a supporter either via PayPal or Patreon, you likewise can get a copy by increasing your support by $1 an episode, or if you're a PayPal supporter, beginning a Patreon support at $1 an episode. Again, this is at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is poet and essayist Morgan Parker. Parker is the author of the poetry collection Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night from Switchback Books, which was selected by Eileen Miles for the 2013 Gatewood Prize and was a finalist for the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award. Parker received her bachelor's degree in anthropology and in creative writing from Columbia University and her MFA in poetry from NYU. Her poetry and essays have been published and anthologized in the Paris Review, the Breakbeat Poets' New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop, Best American Poetry 2016, the New York Times, and The Nation. Parker is the recipient of a 2017 National Endowment of the Arts Literature Fellowship, winner of a 2016 Pushcart Prize, and she is a Cave Canem Graduate Fellow. She's also an editor for Day One and Little A, and the creator and host of Reparations Live at the Ace Hotel in New York. She also co-curates with Tommy Pico the Poets with Attitude reading series, and with Angel Nafis, she is the Other Black Girl Collective. She's here today to talk about her new collection just out from Tin House Books entitled There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyoncé. Publishers Weekly, in its starred review, calls the book an homage to the deep roots and collective wisdom of Black womanhood. Poet D.A. Powell quotes Gwendolyn Brooks, who said, "Art hurts and art urges voyages." Powell says Morgan Parker's poems hurt deeply and voyage widely. They do not let you sit comfortably and idly and safe, but take you on an adventure like no other. Poet Terrence Hayes calls Morgan Parker a fearlessly forward and forward-thinking literary star. Roxane Gay says every poem will get its hooks in you, and author Kiesi Lehman says there is not a more daring artist or anyone he'd rather read in the 21st century than Morgan Parker. Welcome to Between the Covers, Morgan Parker.
Thank you. Hello.
So, Beyoncé is a reoccurring figure in this collection.
Yes.
There are poems called Beyoncé Celebrates Black History Month, Robo Beyoncé, Beyoncé on the Line for Gaga, White Beyoncé, Slouching Toward Beyoncé, What Beyoncé Won't Say on a Shrink's Couch, and many, many more. I'm leaving many out. But you say that Beyoncé in this collection is not Beyoncé Knowles Carter per se, not the human being, but Beyoncé as a symbol or an image or a vessel to look at other things. So I'm hoping you can talk about that, how you're employing Beyoncé as a figure in the collection as a way to begin.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always say, this isn't a biography. She's not going to read this and say, yes, that is accurate. It's really a way for me to talk about the multiplicity of Black womanhood and all the different complexities and all the different people that we can be and are and perform as. I wanted to write a book where I really was exploring this toed line between glamour and vulnerability, of performance, putting on a performance in the public, and also just who you are in private. And so I wanted to use a celebrity kind of pop figure, one that we just associate with beauty and glamour and power, and kind of trouble that and complicate it a little bit. So for all intents and purposes in the book, Beyoncé is just the every Black woman,
Yeah.
She's me, she's my friends. I don't know if she has a shrink, but I do. So,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of, not exactly persona poems, but more of picking up these different masks. And there's something about inhabiting her, I guess, identity and legacy that allows me to explore something beyond myself.
Well, I love the paradox of the fact that you're choosing one celebrity and one image, essentially, to explore diversity in
Absolutely.
Black womanhood, and to potentially explode a static image of Black women. But could you tell us what that static image is in your mind? What is the static image of Black womanhood that you're trying to complicate?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple, and I kind of touch on some of the roots of them in the book. So thinking about the legacy of, the Hottentot Venus, of Black women on display to be kind of gawked at or upheld as this standard. It's kind of a similar thing to Beyoncé, It's a little bit of both. I wanted to think about that, like the body as being consumed. And then also, the stereotype of the Black woman as kind of matronly and just hardworking and quiet. And so there are a few, I think Beyoncé is the one more attached to this kind of sexual being, beauty, uncomplicated. And so it's that, but it's also this kind of vulnerable, Black women are the mules of the world, that kind of thing. And so I wanted to basically push those together, but then also point outwards at all the other things that we are. And also talk a little bit about what it feels like to know that those stereotypes exist and almost sometimes use them to your advantage, to acknowledge them in order to self-define. It's a really complicated relationship. I always say, as Black women, we start at negative 100. We're not born at zero. So we have to first kind of look in the face of and then tear down lots of stereotypes and things that we've been told about ourselves and internalize about ourselves in order to really kind of figure out who we are and who we're allowing ourselves to be.
Well, it's interesting also, I was curious in reading this that Beyoncé, who maybe you chose as a celebrity and one person to as a counterbalance against this idea around diversity and exploding the static image of Black women, she has evolved a lot.
Oh, yeah.
So in a way, she didn't stay the same. And I
think she read my poems, if that's what you were going to ask. I think I spoke formation into existence. Yeah, I mean, it's been weird, right? Like, a lot of folks have asked me. I mean, when Lemonade came out, this was already at the printer, so I wasn't responding to that version of her. So she's become someone wildly different in the time of the writing. And even, so I started writing these poems around the time that she was collaborating with Lady Gaga, and I kind of started with that. And that was just that was like 3 albums ago, so it was a long time ago.
Right.
And from there, that was like before she and like the president were friends, and so there was kind of that, which allowed me to talk about politics in a really easy way. Like she was kind of associated. And yeah, I really do think it's interesting how she has evolved and how I really believe that, the public asked for her to evolve.
Yeah.
And, probably an intern showed her my poems. Just saying.
Well, when I interviewed Tyehimba Jess about Olio,
oh my God, I love him, by the way.
I do too.
I call him Uncle. He's got such an uncle thing.
Oh. Well, I mean, his book also centers around performance and Black performers explicitly, and also around this conundrum of Black performance, especially when Black entertainers aren't necessarily performing for a Black audience.
Yep.
They're performing for an audience that, in some ways, that gaze, the white gaze, is something that needs to be negotiated around this idea of authenticity. Like, how do you keep your music authentic, and how do you get it heard?
And authentic to us is different, I think, than, the white gaze sees something and is like, oh, that's authentic Black, but that is something that's manufactured for their eyes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so we have this idea of the double consciousness, right? But I believe that for Black women, it's like quadruple consciousness. Like there are a lot of different levels and layers and languages you have to speak.
Can you talk, for listeners who don't know what the double consciousness is, can you talk a little bit about that?
So that is I think it's from the Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois, writing about the kind of the way that Black people in America have one mind that is them, but then also almost kind of thinking with a white mind as well. And just knowing that is, I guess, the standard in the world. So it's a way of knowing, of having to negotiate everything that you say, and almost having to like translate and interpret all your thoughts.
So can you tell us a little bit about the ways in which you find your poetry performative or not? And you mentioned persona poems, so I was kind of curious about the I. Is it sounds like it isn't a stable I, and I was curious if you place your poetry in a sort of in a more performative subset of poetry, or if that's not true at all.
Yeah, I don't think of it as performance. I mean, I think about my existence as performative, like rather, so that I think about it in that way. But in terms of reading it out loud or anything of that sort, I mean, the poems are quite personal, and the I always begins with me, but I did want to kind of stretch it out a little bit with the writing of this book, and also mine the parts of myself that haven't spoken before. So the I is, it's me, but it isn't me, and it's parts of me that no longer exist. It's parts of me that I want to exist, and it's parts of me that I see in others. So, yeah, the I is very flexible in that way. But at the end of the day, they are kind of almost confessional,
Yeah. Well, let's have our listeners hear a couple Beyoncé-themed poems, specifically poem on Beyoncé's birthday and Beyoncé in third person.
Poem on Beyoncé's birthday. Drinking cough syrup from a glass shaped like your body I wish was mine, but as dark as something in my mind telling me I'm not woman enough for these days. Colored with reddish loathing, which feels to me more significant than sun. My existence keeps going, ripple in other people's mouths, pools of privilege and worship. I keep thinking. I am exclusively post everything. Animals licking my chin, new leaves stretching from a palm plant like a man's greedy arms. Today, your open eyes are two fresh buds. Anything could be waiting. Beyoncé in third person. I type Beyoncé into my phone 5 out of 7 days a week. That's because I am a woman. I'm a little unpolished behind the scenes. I am lonely, and so are all my friends. When one season of The Real Housewives closes, another one opens. New moons disappear unmagically. I am very complicated, and so is Beyoncé. Dogs in their gate of privilege circle her. Snow falls for her, shellacs windows for her. Beyoncé, are you sure you're okay? I slice lemons in my quiet apartment and pile them on a step. When I think about revolution, I turn to the B-side of Dangerously in Love. I sequin my breasts like morning shells, teeth sucked as performance. People say things they think are true, like, I love you, and I feel in a particular way. I want to be so close and bold. In the news today, Beyoncé went to brunch this weekend. 2 neighborhoods over, dressed in all black. Comparing salad recipes and third-wheeling weekend dinners, dog kibble in my loafers, seducing myself in sweatpants, is not how I envision my 20s, or is it? In high school, I made a mixtape called Ladies as Pimps Too. That was long before my therapist asked about my masculinity while new buds in Riverside Park slobbered with rain. The only dream I've had all year is the one where I'm driving out of control. The brakes are shot, the landscape changes, I accelerate instead of stop. It's almost too obvious to interpret, like teeth or pomegranates or ocean. If you aren't interested in self-absorption, do not follow me on Twitter. Sometimes I think I should have been left in the incubator longer. Everyone got high levels of entitlement in our veins. We think we are owed everything, but especially silence. A secret is, during commercials, I am living other lives, sautéing green vegetables, imagining spring breeze carry me through the apartment like a branch or a painter. There is no humor in touch, the absolute truth. If I breathed on Beyoncé, would she begin to weep? I go to sleep, it's dark, no one breathes.
You've been listening to poet Morgan Parker read from her collection, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyoncé, just out by Tin House Books. So with regards to this enterprise of shattering stereotypes around Black womanhood and specifically, you've talked about how, as a Black woman writing poetry in an MFA program, using pop culture and humor, that you were pigeonholed, and that what you were expected to write and who you were as an artist became flattened. And I was hoping maybe you could just unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. It's something I really fought against when I was getting my MFA, and it's something that was asked of me that wasn't asked of my peers. You know, I think I make a joke in a poem, and they're like, are you afraid of being pigeonholed as a humorous poet or a fluffy, light poet? And I found that to be interesting because many poets use humor. And I think, you know, in my opinion, it's the type of humor, it's the type of references. Everyone's referencing in poetry. But if I was referencing Michelangelo, no one would, no one would care. So I do think that there's this tension of people wanting poetry to be this sacred thing. That exists not in the context of the world that we live in. And it disturbs that kind of glass box for me to bring Beyoncé into poetry and demand that it be read as if it were any other poem. You know, I think these poems are not light. They're not simple and they're not easy. And I think that folks are sometimes compelled to write them off as such, just because the title is funny or there's a joke about, dog kibble on my loafers, like that. But to me, like, that's the best way of describing like a kind of loneliness, and I would just ask for like more, just more thought, and I think it was something I had to actually request.
Yeah.
Of my peers.
Well, in that vein, you've also talked about how, because of the frequent pop culture references, that people will say, "Is this poetry? What type of poetry is this? If it is poetry," and that you feel like under that there is a sort of some unexamined racism.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's part of this false sense we have of what is proper poetry. What is sacred? What is? I mean, I just don't know about pastures, like I just don't know about them. This is what I know about. And poets write about their worlds, and this is my world. And I think that if that kind of disturbs someone's sense of what is worthy of poetry, then that's a question for them to think about, why. Yeah, I really do think that it's easy to call popular mainstream Black art low art versus high art, and I think that's a little bit what it is. It's almost like I hear an undercurrent of you don't belong here, like you can't bring your stuff into this space, this sacred space of poetry, of Pound or whatever, but. So that's kind of what's happening, I think, and no one would ever say it in that way, and I don't think that is a conscious thing that people are thinking, but I would ask folks to consider why they, kind of balk at seeing pop culture handled in this way.
You probably know more than me as a poet, but I would imagine there's plenty of examples of white poets in the past who were using contemporary art.
Frank O'Hara. T.S. Eliot,
right?
I mean, and the other thing is people always say, are you afraid that your work will be dated or it's too much in this time, like you need to remove any timestamps? But, you need a whole, you need 3 books to read The Wasteland, and figure out what was the context of what Eliot was talking about. And, now we have Google. And I think that people will be fine, So I think we forget that is just the way that poetry is. There's always references to the world that the poet is living in. And if there isn't, it's probably a boring poem,
Yeah. Well, you've said in this line also, you said that for a long time you felt like poetry's job was to make you feel small and dumb, and that you hated poetry most of your life. That it had nothing to do with you, that its system of references didn't reference you and the references that you have in your own life. You wrote this really great piece, Bring Your Own Canon, for the Poetry Foundation blog, where you say that the secret weapon of the white supremacist patriarchy, the answer to how can another cop walk free, the reason why the term minority doesn't need to correspond with actual data, it's in the mind. And then you say, I want to be aware of when the systems I don't trust, the systems that make me afraid for my life, have made their way into the way I think and how I see the world. It sounds hard, and I'm not claiming I'll be able to even spot all the ways that I have gotten into bed with the supremacy, but it sounds easier and better than losing weight, quitting smoking, online dating. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your process of doing this, of both breaking down references that aren't yours, but also of building up a constellation of references that feel alive to you and building your own canon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was really what was at stake in the writing of this book. This book is full of people, of songs, of films, and I wanted to kind of say, okay, this is the stuff of my world. This is the aesthetic. These are the influences. And it felt important for me to name check a lot of things, bring them in, and present a wide picture, and some of the things you might guess, Jet Magazine, but other things you might not, like Wife Swap. That's all the stuff of my life. And so it felt important for me to call those things out and really lay them out. I think often there's a little bit of shame that white supremacy puts on us, where things become guilty pleasures or things become things to not talk about in mixed company. And I wanted to kind of blow that out of the water and make my book a safe space to really honor all of those things, and not feel that it would be deemed anti-intellectual or anything like that. And I do think that, I do think that so much of the writing I have to remember to speak to myself. And it can be a scary process and kind of a lonely one where I'm writing, I'm referencing all these things, and maybe the folks in my MFA are saying, I don't know what this refers to, and I have to be okay with that,
Right.
instead of writing toward something that the white supremacist patriarchy can understand. I have to be okay with them not understanding all of it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a poem. The eternal themes of poetry are there. Love, loss, grief, it's all, that will be relatable if you're a human being and want to access it.
Well, what about the poetry canon in and of itself? Like if I imagine you building your own poetry canon, and you did write a love letter to Black women poets and possibility. Who are some of the poets in the Morgan Parker canon?
Absolutely. So those that I published in BuzzFeed was Delana R.A. Dameron, Kimon Felix, Khadijah Queen. Who else was in there? Oh, Ria Cortez. Angel Nafis is my collaborator, and she has a great influence on my work. But there are also elder poets that I reference a lot. Nikki Giovanni is in here. Gwendolyn Brooks is a ghost in here. So I'm thinking a lot about a wide variety of Black women poets. And what's cool is to see, the differences. I mean, aesthetically, in terms of content, in terms of language, it's really exciting for me. And all of it feels true, So I really am interested in seeing the wide variety of ways that Black women are representing themselves in poetry. There are so many. It's like all my homegirls. I love them all so much.
It's not often that I have a guest who's had an interview or profile on ESPN. So I loved this.
That was for my dad.
Yeah. ESPN did a profile about the influences of boxing, of your grandfather, who was a boxer, on your poetry. And I would love for you to describe how and in what ways your grandfather or the boxing of your grandfather becomes an influence in terms of how you write lines or what you're looking for aesthetically when you're putting together a poem.
I mean, I have to say that I surprised myself in that interview. And I surprised the interviewer as well, so we were planning on talking about the book, and she wasn't really sure how she was going to make it fit.
Yeah.
And she asked because I also don't watch sports. I don't engage with sports literally at all. So, but she asked if there was an athlete that I looked up to as inspiration. And one is my grandfather, and he was a boxer. And I think he and I have similar spirit. He was just a jokester. He was really gregarious and sharp and loved talking to people and was very performative. And there is an attitude and a fierceness in him that I was taught from a young age. And I see that in myself as, a grown woman. And it's interesting to think about boxing. There is the fight, obviously, and there's that kind of feistiness and fire in the gut, and I think that would describe my poetry. but also my personhood. I can see how that's translated. And, boxing is strategic. It's really intellectual, and it requires kind of circling around something and then also being super direct. And so that's definitely in my writing process, thinking about, okay, what's the line that's going to be the KO? How do I circle the subject and position myself in order to really knock them in the face? And, how do I take some punches myself in the meantime? So that's definitely part of my process. It is like a fight. It is like this choreographed, and it's violent, to a certain extent.
We're talking today to poet Morgan Parker about her latest book from Tin House Books, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyoncé. You've also written about growing up in mostly white environments in school. And in your essay, in particular, White People Love Me, Dispatches from the Token, you describe something you call the post-Beyoncé complex. Every minute of my black girl day is doubled. I'm both erased and glorified with each Miley twerk each time a white girl friend exclaims girl. White teens on Twitter wearing grills hashtag gangsta. Taylor Swift in heavy gold hoops among a chorus row of shaking black asses. The black woman is sex, inexplicable, cool, exotic, edgy, as long as she is empty. As long as you can hold her in your palm or drape her around your neck. Paul Mooney said, everybody wants to be black and nobody wants to be black. So I was hoping you could read your poem Afro and then maybe talk about its origins in relationship to this doubling and growing up among a lot of white people.
So I wrote this poem about the TSA. So I'll start with that. Afro. I'm hiding secrets and weapons in there. Buttermilk, pancake cardboard, boxes of purple juice, a magic word our Auntie Angela spoke into her fist and released into hot black evening like gunpowder or a cool. 40 yards of cheap wax prints, the autobiography of Malcolm X, a Zulu folktale warning against hunters drunk on polo shirts and Jägermeister. Blueprints for building ergonomically perfect dancers and athletes. The chords to what would have been Michael's next song, a mule stuffed with diamonds and gold, Miss Holliday's vocal cords, the jokes Dave Chappelle's been crafting off the grid. Sex and brown liquor intended for distribution at Sunday schools in white suburbs, or, in other words, exactly what a white glove might expect to find, taped to my leg and swallowed down my gullet and locked in my trunk and fogging my dirty mind and glowing like treasure in my autopsy.
You just heard Afro by Morgan Parker. You said it was about the TSA, but I assumed it was about a vignette that I read in one of your essays about charging some of your classmates
I did do that.
to touch your hair.
I did that in college. It was a joke. It was like $1. But I think, I love doing things like that where I'm making fun and pointing out what is ridiculous about my existence and what people make ridiculous about my existence. Around this time, I had seen quite a few essays written about Black women getting stopped by the TSA and having them search through their hair. And I always say, what are they expecting to find? There's a little bit of a magical Negro thing of it, you'll find all of our Black secrets in here.
Right.
So that was kind of the departure point for this poem. And of course it turned into, okay, what might the white gaze think are our most treasured things that they would want to access. In the essay that you referenced, I'm thinking about that as well. What are the parts of Black culture that white people are so jealous of and so that they so desire that they dress up in it as a costume. So it's not it's it's just like Paul Mooney said. It's not blackness. It is Blackness the costume. Like, that's the thing that they like.
Right.
And not really maybe what we have to say or our continued presence, but the stuff of Blackness they certainly want, So it's a little bit of that. But there's also, especially towards the end of this poem, this kind of threatening Blackness that will like contaminate white spaces. So that also was on my mind.
What's really interesting about some of the stuff that you're doing with tokenism in the poetry collection, and then connecting that to some of the stuff you're doing in your essays around the way in which you become a token. And you're using Beyoncé in a way as one to explode tokenism. You've written about the MFA experience of becoming one, but also going with your class to the Museum of Tolerance and then sort of becoming an empty vessel for like white crimes on the history of Black people, where people come up and hug you after they go to the museum.
Yes, many a white classmate has apologized on behalf of their ancestors.
Right.
And I mean, that true moment of my life was so formative and continues to be something that I want to, I guess, investigate and mine, because many things are at play, right? Like, on one hand, I understand where they're coming from, or they're struck with this guilt and suddenly want to be absolved. And I become this like priest figure. But also it then I remember it kind of making me feel like I had to say, oh no, there's something to apologize for. I wasn't a slave.
Right.
But there is something I write about reparations. Like, that is, I do believe that I am owed an apology.
Yeah.
But and this is something that I think white people in America today have a hard time with, because it becomes this one-on-one thing. It becomes, but I'm your friend. I never did anything to you. You didn't. Whiteness did, So,
yeah.
And I think this kind of idea of taking it personally versus politically is difficult. And yeah, I don't know. It's a tough spot.
What I'd love to pivot around this is that how tokenism, or suffering under it, essentially, can have mental health effects. And you do link these two in the piece. Tokenism may cause the following side effects, and one of them being you will get tired, you will be loved, and it will make you tired. So the Museum of Tolerance example could be one example of that. But you, in your poetry, you go into your own mental health struggles, both in your essays and in your poetry. And you've also spoken a lot about mental health in relationship to Black culture. Like, your dad was like, well, Black people don't go to therapy. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what process that was for you to decide to include depression and anxiety. I would imagine part of it on a bigger level is exploding like a static view of Black women, but it's also a real exposing of something about yourself at the same time.
Right. And I mean, if I wanted to be honest, if I wanted to present the full picture, I had to. I don't go easy on myself in my writing, and I don't necessarily paint the best picture of myself. That's not what it's for. This book is not going to give me any dates anytime soon, but I think it's important to really kind of show what's behind the scenes, and especially when what people see up front is so polished and considerate of them. So I mean, I grew up being diagnosed at 15 and completely ashamed and really secretive. I would go to therapy and tell no one. My friends didn't know. I'm like secretly taking pills. And so now in my life, it feels super important to just talk relentlessly about it. Part of that is this kind of larger stigma of talking about mental health. I think it's ridiculous, So that's certainly part of it, and I'm doing it on behalf of my past self. I'm doing it on behalf of anyone who doesn't feel safe speaking about that. But secondarily, as a Black woman and just as a Black person, it's not a conversation that we have enough. we're getting better, but there's definitely is a stigma in the Black community about mental health. You know, I grew up and, you know, I have certain cousins, aunts, uncles, far removed that are like crazy. And I'm like, they probably have a diagnosable illness, but it's just like, oh, they just do this sometimes. I also think that it's a hard thing to talk about because there is this strong Black woman stereotype, but it isn't a stereotype. Like, it's real. Like, we're actually extremely strong and have withstood so much in our lifetimes and in our past lifetimes. But that doesn't mean that we can't go to therapy. You know, it's like just because we can survive it, because we always have, we know we will, does not mean that we should struggle. But there is a kind of romanticism of struggle in the Black female kind of body and in our community. So that's something that I struggle with negotiating myself. I'm definitely in therapy. I'm taking medicine, and I'm committed to my care. But at the same time, I also know that I have this natural inclination to work myself to death, and that's something I wanted to, I guess, place as these kind of dichotomies that live inside of me.
Maybe this is a good time to read a couple more poems.
Cool.
I was thinking, We Don't Know When We Were Opened, and The Gospel According to Her.
Cool. We don't know when we were opened or the origin of the universe, after Mickalene Thomas. A sip of liquor from a creek. Saturday, syndicated good times, bare legs, colors draped like an afterthought, we, bright enough to blind you. Dear anyone, dear high-heel metronome, white noise, hush us, shh, hush us. We're artisanal crafts, rare gems, bed of leafy bush, you call us superfood. Jeweled lips, we're rich, we're everyone. We have ideas and vaginas, history and clothes and a mother, portrait-ready American blues, palm trees and back issues of Jet, pink lotion, gin on ice, zebras, fig lipstick. One day, we learned to migrate. One day, we studied Mama making her face. Bright new brown, scent of Nana and cinnamon. Shadows of husbands and vineyards, records curated to our allure, incense, unconcern. Champagne is how the Xanax goes down, royal blue raining. We're begging anyone not to forget we're turned on with control. We better homes and gardens, we real grown, we garden of soil panties, we low hum of satisfaction, we is touch, touch. Shine, a little taste, you're gonna give us the love we need. The Gospel According to Her. What to a slave is the 4th of July? What to a woman is a vote? What to a slave is river water? What to a slave is an award show? What to a slave is fine china? What to a woman is a canopy bed? What to a slave is a hard sky? What to a woman is please? What to a woman is the bottom of a glass? What to a slave are flatlands from an aircraft? What to a woman is permission? What to a woman is the Milky Way? What to a slave is a square? Technically, it's perfect.
Been listening to poet Morgan Parker read from her collection, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyoncé. You've said that sometimes I think my depression is the most normal thing about me. We should all get free therapy. We could call it reparations. But in other places, you've also said that it is hard to find therapy that is actually a tool for a Black person's liberation. And that made me think of that really harrowing scene in Claudia Rankine's Citizen when she on the phone makes an appointment with a trauma therapist and then shows up at the trauma therapist's door and knocks, and the woman comes out and screams for her to get off her lawn, unable to conceive that her patient seeking trauma therapy would be Black, or that a Black person would be on her property. Can you talk a little bit about this question of both maybe self-interrogation within the Black culture around seeking mental health, but then maybe that the infrastructure isn't really there
Yeah.
for the right type of engagement.
It's hard. I mean, I lately have picked up this new nickname of therapy Yelp because I am known for helping people try to find a therapist, and I think so many of us just don't go because it seems daunting, and all the therapists we can imagine are like on the Upper West Side and don't look like us and probably don't understand our problems, especially if what you need to talk about, which everyone should, is the way that white supremacy kind of wreaks havoc on your mind and body on a regular basis. You know, that's totally linked to everything. So I had a really bad experience with a therapist. She was good otherwise, but I kind of around that time was realizing how closely linked America and America's history, but also present. This was around the time of Ferguson, and I really felt that as closely linked to what I was experiencing on a day-to-day basis and with my depression. And I had never really been able to articulate that in such a clear way before. And the therapist kind of couldn't handle it. She was like, "What's going on in Ferguson? Oh, Missouri? I've never heard about this." And, you know, that was disturbing to me.
Wow.
She said she didn't have a TV, but I'm like, who are you around that is not, you know? And that was scary to me. That was scary because then I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like she could help me. Then I also was like, are you a white supremacist? Because how is no one around you clued you in? And also, why aren't you looking it up? You know, like what's going on here? So that was a kind of a scary thing. And when I broke up with her, which I had to do, she made it very awkward. And I was like, you know, I really need to talk about culture and how it is affecting me. And she was like, well, why didn't you find a therapist of color? And I was like, hey, like, what? I didn't really realize that I wanted to spend so much time talking about this, but also it's hard. And so now I do think about that. And I also, you know, when I'm looking for new therapists, I make sure to make a note that I need someone that's like culturally sensitive to specifically to the traumas that I have as a Black woman. And, you know, it's a hard thing because it just isn't a field that we dominate. And I mean, it's there's something that needs to be done on the level of education probably, so that more Black women can become psychiatrists.
Right.
There are more certainly that are therapists. I also need medication management, so it is nice to have a psychiatrist who can do all those things, and it's really hard to find. And I live in New York. There's a lot of therapists there. And it's still hard, you know, and it's really expensive, and you know, I don't know. It's a big problem, and I think it's a problem because there's so much that. First of all, there's no space that isn't kind of contaminated by white supremacy. So ideally, therapy would be that space where you can kind of try to not be focused on the white gaze or not be focused on that, you know, quadruple translation in order to just talk about your life. I have a therapist who's a woman of color. She's great about that and seeks to understand and is clear about what she doesn't understand, is clear about what she does, and listens. You know, so and that makes a big difference. But it is hard to find, and it is hard, even to remember. You know, for me, not to be kind of performing for white supremacy, even in the space of therapy.
Well, it's interesting with you broadening the context of depression from something individual from something wrong with brain chemistry
Absolutely.
to something political and social, and potentially a normal response for inescapable pressures of marginalized people.
Absolutely.
You also do this with love and loneliness in this collection too, I think. You quote a line from Amiri Baraka's poem Black Art that says, "Let there be no love poems written until love can exist freely and cleanly." It feels like your collection is in kindred spirit with this statement. Does that seem like it to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess while I was writing this, it became super clear to me that loneliness is also, I mean, I think I asked the question in the book, is loneliness cultural? Because it does feel, encircling what it feels like to be a Black woman, it's lonely. And I think that this distance from love and intimacy is built into all the other things, how we're looked at, how we're perceived. And again, that's something that I'm working through on a personal level, but, then seeing as a larger thing. So same with depression. It's like, yes, do I, need, what is it, like serotonin? Like, am I missing that? But also, what are the other factors at play? And really just kind of seeing the whole picture. I think that this book is a very lonely one, as much as it is full of people and experiences and joy and celebration. There's kind of a sense of going home alone at the end of the night. That's kind of hovering in the book. The speaker is often amongst folks, but the kind of utterance of the poem always kind of comes in quiet and aloneness. So it's about isolation. It's about being misunderstood and not seen fully. And that's all really lonely. And it's hard to connect on an intimate level and not just a social level, when that is your experience walking through the world. It's almost like we're kind of led to, well, there's also, we're led to believe that we're not lovable. So we almost kind of enact that and internalize that and make it our problem,
Is it a stretch to, I imagine that your background in anthropology is part of...
It's very everywhere, yeah.
I mean, I imagine that's part of the impulse of taking either depression and anxiety or loneliness away from the individual and sort of placing it in the collective, and also examining the health of the community or the health of the larger group. Is that from that background as an anthropologist?
I think so. I mean, you don't know what comes first, right? Like I've always been a person that is interested in like systems and I don't know, just very nerdy in terms of like, why do we do this? Why do we think what we think? And I think that is just like my natural impulse, which led me to anthropology. I'm just nosy and endlessly like curious about people. Which is why I, really took to anthro. And I think that, to me, it's a similar field to writing, or it's a similar part of my brain that I'm using. And I also have spent enough time kind of interrogating myself, and I'm good on that front. I think I understand on an individual level why I am how I am, but it's time to kind of take a wider scope and think about what made me who I am before I was even born. And I think that kind of was a little bit of, and that's certainly, the work that I'm working on now is even more so. This book is really kind of looking around instead of inside of the speaker. And that felt like an important move for me and for my work. And I think that's certainly there, of thinking about, okay, what are our customs? What are our aesthetics? What are our canons of, what are our influences, references? How do we speak to each other? How do we speak to outsiders? How do we love? Do we love? These types of questions are in the book. And I think I had already answered the question of how do I do that stuff, but really thinking about a more kind of groupthink and collective type of experience.
Well, speaking of groupthink, you also critique this idea in multiple essays, including some that we mentioned, but also in I Don't Need Diverse Books, the idea that when one of us wins, we all win. And that makes me think of President Obama becoming president in relation to the state of the Black community at large.
Oh, yeah.
And also to your poem, The President Has Never Said the Word Black, which was the first time I encountered your poetry, which in New York Times Magazine, when Matthew Zapruder put it in the New York Times.
Thanks, Matthew.
So I was hoping you could read that poem
Absolutely.
for us.
The president has never said the word black. To the extent that one begins to wonder if he is broken. It is not so difficult to open teeth and brass taxes. The president is all like, 5 on the bleep hand side. The president be like, we lost a young boy today. The pursuit of happiness is guaranteed for all fellow Americans. He is nobody special like us. He says brothers and sisters. What kind of bodies are movable and feasts? What color are visions? When he opens his mouth, a chameleon is inside, starving.
I remember when this poem came out in the New York Times Magazine, you saying, and it was at a time when no one thought Trump would be president, but he was on the rise. Like he was, some people thought he could be president, but he was definitely on the ascendant. And you'd said it felt weird to be calling out Obama in that climate.
Sure.
While at the same time you stood by every word in the poem.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a book of contradictions, and that's important to it. It's a book of giving the whole picture, even when presenting something in a one-sided way isn't fair. It isn't doing justice, and I think that this is kind of a critique of President Obama that a lot of Black people had, and I love the hell out of him, and it doesn't change. At this point, I'm like, he is literally Jesus Christ, because there's the alternative is crazy. But I think that it's a complicated thing, right? And part of that poem is talking about how complicated it is to critique that, because we understand it. I think it's not necessarily about what is authentic Black or is he Black enough. I think it's more along the lines of, okay, you're representing us, but you're also not. Like, you're not speaking on behalf of us the way that you could. But we also know why he's not doing that. Right. And it is a way of protecting himself and protecting us. So I think, this was a hard poem for me to write because of all those things and because I understand both sides of it. But it also felt important to kind of get out and try to articulate. That chameleon is doing a lot of work where it's like we understand what that feels like. We understand what it feels like to kind of repress and keep quiet, and why we do that, Yeah. So it's I really do think it's a critique, but it's also it's a sympathetic one.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like your writing has or will change since Trump is in power, in the sense that we don't have the typical white president in power? We now have like an entire all bets are off, it seems like, at this point.
Yep. I'm not interested in writing about him for sure. I do not think that my writing will change. I think that I'll still be tackling the same things. I in this book was pushing myself to not be shy and to not be afraid and really put out what is painful. And I've only done that more, so I think I see the threat. I see the threat against my life and how much time I'll have. And so I'm like, before they lock me up as a political prisoner in T-minus, let me get out everything that I need to say. You won't catch me like wasting any time. Yeah. So I guess that's really the energy and I guess, urgency around what I'm writing has kind of just increased. And I remember showing a friend some newer poems, and they said, "Oh, you're not interested in being charming anymore." And I think it's, it's like I'm out of time for being charming, for taking care of the reader. It's more like just figure it out and, process this on your own.
Yeah.
So maybe that's good. I don't know.
Well, speaking of like the present hostile moment, you've talked a lot about Afrofuturism as a response to a hostile present moment, particularly as a feminist response to a hostile present moment. And there's hints of Afrofuturism in some of the poems. I think of Slouching Toward Beyoncé as one of them. So could you talk a little bit about it? About how you see it in relationship to Black womanhood?
Yeah, I think that, one thing that Black women are good at doing, and I saw somewhere on the internet the other day someone saying that Harriet Tubman was the first Afrofuturist, which makes sense. I mean, one of the things that we do and are good at doing is creating a space, saying, oh, I don't like this. This isn't working for me, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to go away. Let me find a space for myself and for my people. So there's that kind of resilience and that kind of just scrappy like troubleshooting that we're really good at. And I always say, Harriet Tubman was the first one of us to just be like, oh no, this will not stand. I'm not doing this. And so there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of this knowledge in the back of our minds or in our unconscious that we will be okay and we will take care of ourselves, and that this has never felt like home. So I think we're not surprised when people say this isn't your home and you don't belong here. We're like, I know. Like, we're just trying to figure out the portal to get back or forward or wherever, So, and that is very feminist, this kind of self-reliance and innovation and inventiveness about existence, living in the world, but also not of it. I think that's really important to kind of our identities, and that's who we are in wartime.
Can we hear Slouching Toward Beyoncé?
Yeah, absolutely. I should say that I wrote this poem in response to some artwork that my friend Jessica Rankin wrote, and it was very kind of celestial work. So you'll see that. Slouching toward Beyoncé, who reads her horoscope in secret and bathes her loose strings in holy watercolor, cucumbers over the temple. Her body is like mine. It is filled with holes. It starts black and stays black. I keep thinking the only city left is outer space, where we lived before we had tongues. Things don't fall apart. They find new homes. Down here, there's a thing called skin. I keep mine clean. There are things called medication and days. They are hard to believe. I am tired, so I wife myself. Down here, the boys are theoretical. I shrink their hearts. I say spells because I'm magic. Fire is another word for absolute sunset on a high cliff. I am never afraid to jump. Oh, Beyoncé, I love you. Your fragments like a map. I think I am addicted. You soaked blue, you trouble in my sight. The beast has come at last. Hair of a cattail and legs of a palm. The truth like a bowl of seeds. The secret album, midnight. O vessel of womanhood, I am loosed upon the world with dust and filed nails. All my life I turn water into wine. This the hour I lower my shoulders. My second coming. Split screen, clouds like orchid bulbs in the throat.
We've been listening to poet Morgan Parker read from her new collection, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyoncé. I was curious about you as an editor at Little A. And you're not an editor of poetry, you're an editor of fiction.
I am an editor of poetry, fiction,
and poetry.
And nonfiction,
Yeah.
actually. So I'm working on a novel, a memoir, and 2 poetry books, yeah.
How are your tastes in fiction, in the world of prose, when you're looking in through the editor lens?
Yeah, I mean, all of my authors are women, so let's start there. They're all women of color except for one. So that telling women's stories and centering women's voices is important to me as an editor and writer. So that is one obvious. I love fiction. I love novels. I've never written one. It would be cool to, but I currently don't have the patience. But I have loved working on prose and thinking about narrative. I think that's something that is underneath my poems more conceptually than technically. I wouldn't call my poems narrative poems, but I am interested in narrative as a concept. Just in the world, in the way that we conceive of ourselves and conceive of our lives. So I am very interested in stories that explore very deeply individual narratives and contextualize them within a larger space.
Well, when you say that you would be interested in writing a novel, but you don't have the patience, is it not true that you're writing a YA novel?
That's what I'm saying.
That's what you're saying?
It is. I don't have a draft, so
okay.
I still do not know how to write a novel. Well, I am making it up as I go.
Well, let me ask you a question on that line, because you've said before that poetry is more in line with the way our brains work, that we don't think in sentences, but rather leaping from memory to image to thought. So is the Morgan Parker that appears when you're writing prose in sentences a different sort of Morgan Parker? Are you recognizing a different persona in that?
No, quite the opposite, actually. I think even in the way of, fighting against my own inclination and putting things into like a chronological narrative story and relying on sentences and linear time, I'm finding the same Morgan. It's a very similar thing. And I mean, my young adult novel is a loosely based memoir. So as you can imagine, our heroine, Morgan, because I have no imagination, is, growing up depressed, Black in a very white suburb that's super religious and her hijinks ensue.
Yeah.
So that's really it. And I'm finding it to be a really interesting way of fictionalizing a lot of what I'm talking about in my poetry and essays and uttering a lot of the same things, but using different words, which has been funny to see. I didn't really expect that. And then a line will come out that I think, that very well could be in an essay.
Well, I must say that I hope that you will collect your essays at some point. They're really incredible, and I would encourage people to seek them out online but I would hope that might be a future prose book for you too.
Listen, you and my agent are colluding because he's out here telling people that I'm writing many books.
Yeah. Well,
thank you for that.
It was great having you on Between the Covers today.
Yeah,
Morgan.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We were talking today to poet Morgan Parker about her latest collection from Tin House Books, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyoncé. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. If you enjoyed today's program, consider supporting the show by going to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And also while you're there, check out the growing archive of bonus material available. Thanks for listening.